us for this session of the program. My name is Albert Puja. I would say this is a very distinctive session of the program, as it's actually a book launch. And with me for the session, we have the author of the book with us, and then we also have the discussant of the book with us. So in terms of protocols, how we are going to be launching the book, I would start with a brief profile of the author, and then also the profile of the discussant. And then after that, we would welcome the author to give us an introduction or background of the book. And then we can then also have the discussant give us her thought-provoking analysis and thoughts and a critique, so to say, of the book. And we'll open the floor for the attendees in case we have any question on what is discussed. So to start with the profile of the author, we fondly know him as the Dean of the Faculty, Professor Jacques de Ville. He's a Professor of Law and Dean of the Faculty of Law at UWC. He's the author of a number of publications in the area of public law, including constitutional and statutory interpretation, and also judicial review of administrative action in South Africa. His research and publications since 2005 have focused on deconstruction, psychoanalysis, and constitutional theory. This includes the translation of and contribution to a book on legal philosophy, the translation of a text of Jacques Derrida, and 3 books of Derrida and his relation to law. And for the discussant is Ulrike Kistner, a professor emerita in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pretoria, and extraordinary professor in the Department of Public Law in the University of Free State. Her teaching and research activities are focused on social theory, psychoanalytic theory, and political philosophy. She has also translated texts from these fields, among others. The first edition of Fruits, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. And as some of us are already aware, and as you can see from the program, the title of the book is Deconstructive Constitutionalism, Derrida Reading Kant. So again, I'll call on the author of the book, Professor Jacques de Ville, to give us an introduction and background to the book. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Albert. I hope everybody can hear me. So firstly, no, it's gone again. So firstly, thanks very much to the organizers of the conference that we could make this book launch part of the program. That's much appreciated. And for all of you who came to this launch, a special thanks. We have somebody here from France, from Paris as well, who will tell us whether I misunderstood Derrida completely, perhaps. So just on the structure of this discussion, we decided to have it in this form. I kind of just give a very brief background to my writing of the book for 5 minutes or so, because I didn't have time to read the whole book again, and I published it some time ago, so I can't remember, and I won't be able to answer the sound disappears with this thing. So should I keep it a bit? Okay, I'll try to keep it like this and see if this works. Yeah, so if there are any questions towards the end, if we still have time, luckily we have less time, come to ask. So I asked myself rather a few questions. So firstly, why Kant and Derrida? Those of you who know me will know that since the 2000s or late 1990s, I've been obsessed with trying to understand Derrida. I still don't think I do. But yes, I'm trying to figure out what he's saying and what are the implications for law and specifically for constitutional law. And in my reading of Derrida, of course, come across Kant very often. I didn't know much about Kant, and I was really curious to try to understand Kant and to try to understand something of this interrelationship between Derrida and Kant. And I've I think I've come to understand that Kant is quite important for constitutional law and constitutional theory, because I think, I may be wrong, but the way in which we think about justice and about reason, freedom, self-government, democracy, human rights, the animal relationship, criminal responsibility, and state sovereignty are all, I think, still to a large extent determined by Kant's thinking. And so, and I think that these assumptions, no, this thing's gone. These assumptions, no. These assumptions are somewhat problematical, and that's what I tried to explore in the book. So before I say a little bit more about the book, just a few words about the writing process. So this book started quite a long time ago. The idea of the book in 2017, when I went to Berlin on a von Humboldt scholarship, and I spent 3 months there trying to read Kant and to get some sources and so on. And I managed to write 2 essays there, which later became chapters of the book, chapter 6 and chapter 1 on perpetual peace and moral law. But then I became dean in 2018, and I didn't have any time for a year. I spent all my time with a Council on Higher Education review process and all kinds of meetings and stuff. And I gave up on this. I thought, shouldn't I start writing about education? Perhaps that didn't work out either. So towards the end of 2018, there was a research retreat for deans, 3 days, and then I managed to read again a bit, and then I got going again slowly. So in 2018, then or 2019, I worked on this chapter on punishment and crime, and then the next year on freedom, and then came COVID, which was a bit of a blessing in disguise, because I had time again. I didn't have to spend 2 hours a day in traffic and getting ready for work and so on. So I could just in the mornings get up early and try to write a bit. So that was in a sense great. And so I finished the book, the first manuscript of the book in May 2021. So what is the book about? I think towards the end, I realized that what it's really about is the foundations of constitutionalism. So to try to rethink these foundations, which Kant, in a sense, laid for modern constitutionalism, and to try to reconceptualize these, to try to think about them differently by reading Derrida's reading of Kant and also Heidegger's reading of Kant. In 2 chapters, Heidegger plays quite a big role. And so it's not about providing new foundations, but to, in a sense, explore the abyssal foundations of modern constitutionalism as laid down by Kant. And then I also look at 2 exclusions based on Kant's thinking, specifically in relation to the animal, and then the whole thing about crime and criminals and so on, which I think Ulrike will say a bit more about. So it's more about not trying to really, yes, trying to understand Kant, but at the same time looking for tensions and contradictions in his texts, and to find something in his text which kind of go beyond economy, beyond metaphysics. So that's what I think I try to do, rather than looking at his intention. Why did he say this, or why did he say that? So, but the book has modest aims. It doesn't try to solve any problems of the world, or say how we should do this or do that, how we should resolve cases in delict or contract or anything like that, or even in constitutional law, but rather to perhaps look at the starting point or the framework within which we look for solutions to problems. So hopefully there is some worth to the book. So it's about hospitality in the end, about trying to think constitutional law from the perspective of absolute hospitality, if I can put it in one sentence. So, of course, everything didn't work out as I thought in the beginning. When I started laying out the outline of the book, I thought I might write on Kant's critique of judgment, which I know Wessel knows much about, and I really wanted to write something on it, but I just couldn't. It just didn't work out. So something about the cover. So this is that's probably the thing I like most about the book. Yes, it's based on this painting by Ludovic Mercher, who's a French painter. So for me, it says something about a certain groundlessness or instability or dislocation. So it reminded me, the reason why I chose this, it reminded me of, some of you may have been in Paris at the Parc de la Follette, which was designed by Bernard Tschumi and based on deconstruction. And so it has these, can you just, so it has these red structures. So you'll see the whole park is full of these red structures. And he calls them follies or folie in French, and there are about 34, I think, of them within this whole park. And so I don't know if the painter also used that, but there's something for me of that in there. So it's a bit about a system, the Kantian system. You can think that Kant constructed, on which we base our constitutional law, and kind of the madness is the points of madness within that structure that I think that I tried to say something about. One of Mercher's paintings is called Deconstruction, the other one Destructuration. So I think he does play around a bit with Derrida's thinking, but I like this one. It's called Split Diptyque. I like that one a bit more. The dedication, a bit sad, but I dedicated the book to my dad. He passed away during COVID in May 2021. My dad always found interesting, I think, what I was working on, but I think he thought I was a bit crazy, and that the things I wrote are quite crazy. But yes. And then finally, just a few thank yous to Ulrike, who has read the book. So thank you, Ulrike. I hope you won't be the only one, perhaps you are. And then more personally, my partner, Vivian, who's really encouraged me to finish this. I have 3 daughters who, in a way, inspire me. Henk Botha, Henk, he was really my pillar of strength in Berlin while I was trying to read and understand Kant. And as I mentioned also in the preface, Wessel Leroux and Derek Pell, especially in the last few months, gave me quite a bit of material and sources which I could work on to try to finalize the end of the book. And then also to so many of you who are here today, from whom I've really learned a lot over the years. So, and that includes Carl Clay, Dennis Davis, Yaku, Karen. Nico was the first one to appoint me. Dani. So yes, I hope I haven't missed too many people. Johan van der Walt, I don't know if he's online, but I've learned so much from so many of you, and I think in a way I hope it comes out in the book. And then SUNY Press published this. Michael Ranella was brave enough to take this on, and so also thank you to that team. So that's my few words. Ulrike.
Thanks, Jacques, and thanks to the organizers, the Department of Jurisprudence, and in particular, Dani Brandt, Karen van Male, Jacques, and many co-conferencees, I'm sure, who've made this possible for us to get together and also for me to come and participate. I'd like to say a couple of things, not exhaustively about Jacques' book, this beautiful book that we've got lying here, and you will see copies outside. I will say not exhaustively because there are a couple of aspects that I will be zooming in on. But let me just say at the outset, not at a loss when it comes to what is questions. Immanuel Kant gives a definition of a book, and this is what he says in the Metaphysics of Morals. He also has to say quite a few things about copyright, interestingly, even at that time. A book is a writing which represents a discourse that someone delivers to the public by visible signs. End of quote. Whether or not or how it is received by Joe or Josephine public is, of course, an entirely different matter. When Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy met with an uncomprehending reception, his friend Erwin Rode stepped up to ask this question. When a head and a book collide, and it sounds hollow, does it necessarily stem from the book? So if you hear a hollow sound in what I have to say about Jacques' book, I take full responsibility for it. Jacques' recently published book entitled Deconstructive Constitutionalism, Derrida reading Kant, could be said in a certain sense to follow a recipe of slow cooking. It carefully assembles and lays out the main ingredients: Kant's moral philosophical writings, Heidegger's reading of Kant, and as the title suggests, Derrida's uptake of Kant. Around these main ingredients are grouped a number of other essential ones: Kafka's Parable Before the Law, inflected by Derrida's reading of it, Freud's essay, The Ego and the Id, and Reich's compulsion to confess. Kant's universal moral law, encompassing freedom or autonomy and human dignity, grounded in the principle of reason, forms the opening gambit. But the book immediately unhinges the neat triangle by bringing Freud, Lacan, Heidegger, and Derrida, among others, into a debate with Kant. Numerous questions are being thrown up at this interface. The question of the relation between moral and political philosophy, between moral principles and juridical norms, between the moral law and the rule of law, between the Kantian subject, the legal subject, and the subject of psychoanalysis. There are two problems which immediately impinge and which I would like to highlight along with and possibly beyond and outside of the scope accorded to them by the book. The first one relates to the primacy of human dignity in post-World War II constitutionalism and international legal instruments, and in post-apartheid constitutionalism in particular. Human dignity has become the foundational value of constitutional orders and the basis of human rights. The author, Jacques, registers the exclusionary nature of the Kantian notion of human dignity, that is, the exclusion of everything non-human from the protection and respect it accords. I'd want to deepen and broaden this finding. Kant posits that man, der Mensch, is person. It is this notion of person vested by Kant and by post-war constitutionalism with human dignity that has simultaneously come to stand as the subject of rights and of legal capacity. However, the more recent emphasis on person and personality is far from closing the gap between human and citizen. The person as bearer of dignity, imports into constitutionalism gradations and degradations on the spectrum between qualified and disqualified life. The emphasis on person and personality reinstates the divide between human, non-human, and person, on which biolegitimacy gambles. The status of person entails qualifications and disqualifications. It institutes the division between will or reason and biological life, personalization and depersonalization within the human itself, as well as between human and other forms of life. But perhaps even more trenchantly, Jacques observes that as fundamental as the value of human dignity is for contemporary constitutionalism, it has not yet led to a widespread challenge of the founding principles of criminal law, such as guilt and responsibility. With this remark, he opens chapter 5 of his book on crime, punishment, and forgiveness. This chapter introduces the fulcrum of the unconscious and of the symptom into the field of criminal law. The author here orients himself along the lines of Derrida's critical reading of Freud and Reich. This is where the slow cooking gets fast and hot. And this is where I'd like to enter the fray. At first glance, it would appear that we're dealing here with a dual, a Kantian autonomous subject acting freely and intentionally according to its conscious will, and therefore bearing responsibility for its actions, facing off against a Freudian, Reichian subject for whom the conscious ego is not the master of its own house. However, this duel does not remain an antagonism. The contesting roles come together at the point where externally enacted coercion and internally exacted guilt meet. In other words, it returns us to the Kantian subject, giving credibility to Freud's equation of the Kantian moral law with the superego. It is precisely at this point that the psychoanalytic invention of the superego encounters the question of the juridico-political. The question is, how do we explain adherence or obedience to law psychologically? How do we explain voluntary servitude even within a democratic order? Part of the answer, I think, lies in the double inscription of the psychoanalytic subject. Firstly, in terms of a personal history, and secondly, in terms of a system of social relations that are also power relations. The superego, the Über-Ich, is constituted in the image of the father and of the parents, but in the wider sense, also that of authority figures exercising power over the child. Thus, it's not simply a matter of the internalization of paternal authority, as which the Oedipus complex is usually understood, but of the way in which the psychogenetic process feeds into institutions and apparatuses of coercion. Fundamental to the correlation between the unconscious and coercive apparatuses is the transformation of the child's relations with its earliest objects into identifications. In the process, a series emerges of authority, law, and obedience, of transgression, crime, and punishment, and of guilt. To put it more poignantly, a correspondence is being established between power and protection, coercion and obligation, law and morality. But Freud and Reich take the correlation one step further. An equivalence is being established between obedience to the law and transgression of the law. Okay, this is where Derrida does not quite follow them. That is a step that he's not prepared to take along with Freud and Reich. To be able to explain this radical step, we would have to look at the role and functioning of the superego within Freud's model of the psychic apparatus, the later model after 1923. The superego is the site of a double bind. It prescribes both obedience and transgression, and thereby engenders the guilt that it sanctions. It sets interdictions that are to be transgressed and passages to the act that unendingly justify and sustain the need for punishment. It installs a sense of guilt that psychically, structurally precedes the crime. In other words, the sense of guilt can become the unconscious motivation rather than the result of a criminal offense. Thus, the figure of the reasonable man, the fiction, the legal fiction of the reasonable man, is pervaded by unconscious thought and motivations. Freud's model of the psyche enacts a Kafkaesque tribunal. The crimes committed in this context are not conscious, and the sentences cannot acquit the subject of the crime. The subject is thus left in the grip of permanent anxiety. Rather than flying under the radar of responsibility, as Jacques would have it, the subject of psychoanalysis and Kafka's Man from the Country Before the Law are inescapably called to responsiveness and responsibility. On several occasions, Freud harnesses Kant's categorical imperative to his own purposes of describing the workings of the superego, with its unconscious motivations and its harsh cruelty, which Freud associates with the death drive. Considered from this perspective, inflecting Kantian concepts of the moral and juridical law through psychoanalytic theory, which the book presents us with, and through Kafka's parable, probably does more to reconstitute them than to deconstruct them. But maybe there's no need to defend Kant from his deconstructionist critics. The main objection to Kantian principles raised by Jacques' book is that they are in line with metaphysical thinking. This finding is ostensibly pronounced through the lenses of Derrida's understanding of metaphysics, which is not the same as Kant's. Kant explains that for law to pertain to and be binding on all rational beings, it must be grounded in concepts of pure reason, as opposed to inclinations, desires, interests, circumstances, and practical rules of morality, or what we would today call moralisms. At the same time, Kant is acutely aware of the limits of human reason. He concludes the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals with this enigmatic statement, and I'd like to quote it. We do not indeed comprehend the practical, unconditional necessity of the moral imperative, yet we do comprehend its incomprehensibility. And this is all that can reasonably be required of a philosophy that in its principles strives up to the boundary of human reason. So this is a conclusion of Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, on which most of the constitutional thinking depends. The Kantian metaphysics of morals, it would seem, is fully busy deconstructing itself. In that sense, Kant could be considered ultra-deconstructionist, avant la lettre, just as Derrida pronounced himself an ultra-Kantian. And this is the epigraph, one of the epigraphs of Jacques' book. I would want to take this chiasmatically structured relation between Kant and Derrida as a prompt for thinking transformative constitutionalism through the twin moves of deconstructionist and reconstitutive constitutionalism to enhance the conceptual development of the law. But I would want to make this case only if a hollow sound has not been heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Jacques, and also thank you for the discussant for giving us those perspectives. And for those of us that listened, would definitely agree that it's a book that cuts across different fields. It's a book that cuts across different perspectives of scholars. And I think this is the time where we open the floor for questions. So we can, I don't know if we have questions from anyone in attendance.
So this is just a bit of curiosity, really. You mentioned Lacan, and as we know, in Lacan, the superego carries a very particular kind of violence, in that Lacan splits the superego off from the ego ideal, and ultimately the superego becomes the site of transgression, of enjoyment, in the sense of jouissance. So I'm interested to hear how the book negotiates that progression in psychoanalytic thinking of the superego, or does it rather confine itself within the Freudian version of the superego and this paradoxical dual idea of the superego as both allied to the id and to the ego ideal?
To say that I try to avoid saying too much about Lacan, because I don't know Lacan well enough. So I think Ulrike brought out Lacan more than I did. I can't remember exactly what I say about Lacan, but just that I saw, if I remember correctly, some alignment in the thinking between Lacan and Derrida in the way in which they read Kant. But I didn't go into it in a lot of detail. But let me hand to Ulrike if she wants to respond.
Yes, I think the mention of Lacan is rather tangential. But I do agree with you, Jaco, that the valence of the superego between Freud and Lacan is quite different. Of course, the superego takes immense pleasure from torturing the ego and the id. So there is that jouissance element even in Freud, but at the same time, it is not hitched. It is not part of a libido theory. So to the extent that the superego is aligned with the death drive, it cannot be libidinally bound. So I think that's where the difference comes in.
I don't know if we have any other question. Okay.
Thank you, and good to see Ulrike and Jacques. Ulrike, you mentioned that the fundamental exclusion apparently in Kantian thought is the non-human, but of course we are aware of another fundamental exclusion, that of the black. If the Kantian moral universe, I'm thinking the debate between Lucy Allais and Pauline Kleingeld and so forth, of where Kant's racism sits in his philosophy, peripheral or fundamental. Of course, I take the view that it's fundamental, and it's crucial to the question you're asking. Can we reclaim a reread Kant for resolving 20th century constitutional problems. And if in South Africa, one of those constitutional problems is, of course, the afterlife of colonial racism, I'm just curious about where that particular exclusion, where that particular problem is. In other words, is there something in the, shall we call it, the juridical unconscious of constitutionalism that carries the problem that Kant's thought also carries, i.e., not simply the exclusion of the non-human, but a hierarchy of humans that continues to persist today. In simple terms, how do you deal with the problem of Kant's racism as a fundamental part of his philosophy as opposed to peripheral? Thank you.
I'll start and then hand over to Ulrike. So Joel, yes, I try to cover all my bases. So you'll see that in the first chapter on alliances, I align myself with you. So yes, so I found quite some resonance with those South African Journal on Human Rights articles in 2018 on post-colonialism, and tried to just start to think, how Derrida's thinking, how that ties in with post-coloniality. And just briefly, because I can't remember everything, but to me, by trying to overcome metaphysics in a way, because as you point out, that the whole Kantian system is metaphysics, and so what our whole constitution is therefore also, in a sense, metaphysical, and a new constitution would probably be as well. So it's only by thinking beyond metaphysics that we can actually be post-colonial. And so what I'm calling for, in a way, is a certain suspension of the Constitution in every instance of judgment. That's how I could, as a brief and provisional response to your question.
Okay, I don't know how to respond to this question in a short space of time. I think I would align myself with the work of Lucy Allais and Pauline Kleingeld about in pointing out a tension in Kant's writings, and that tension, okay, it depends on what kind of reading one brings to it, that tension develops towards the later writings, doesn't get resolved, but it develops towards the later writings towards perpetual peace, where I think a very different perspective is being announced, which Derrida takes up and is very prominent in Jacques' book, namely that of absolute hospitality. So yes, the racist elements cannot be discounted, but there is, I think Pauline Kleingeld would make the case for a break in Kant's work. That's debatable, but certainly towards perpetual peace, there's a very different perspective on colonialism, quite a critical one, and the assertion of the principle of hospitality, even though for Kant it remains limited. Derrida extends that into absolute hospitality and forgiveness, which I think Jacques is giving much more scope to than I would be prepared to give to it.
Okay, so I think in the absence of any other question, thank you so much for your listening ears, and thank you so much for your participation. And this would bring an end to the launch. Thank you so much.